Faith has to be exercised. We have to step forward in that trust and faith that we have in the Lord. And so are we willing to exercise faith when all it seems that we see are dry bones in front of us? The story from Ezekiel, I think, quickly captures our attention, especially as we think about the literature, that apocalyptic literature. We like that apocalyptic literature that speaks about things to come, things, eschatology, things that are coming. Ezekiel does a lot of that. Jeremiah does that. Daniel does a lot of that. And of course, the Revelation does that as well. That apocalyptic literature. It's visionary, prophetic literature consisting of visions whose events are recorded exactly as they were seen by the author. This is what Ezekiel saw. This is how God moved in that moment. And so we have that revelation here of the Lord in Ezekiel's life, and the Spirit of God moved Ezekiel to share that with us as well. Ezekiel was the one who saw this vision. Ezekiel, if you know anything about him, he was born in Jerusalem, but he was taken to Babylon, as many young people were, Jewish people who never grew up in Jerusalem, never knew the Lord, working and moving in the land that He gave His people. He was carried off into exile into Babylon. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Ezekiel prophesied in Babylon. Jeremiah prophesied in Jerusalem to those who were left behind. Their primary focus was to keep the sin of rebellion before the people. That sounds like what a preacher is supposed to do today, isn't it? Keep the sin of rebellion before people, unsaved and saved alike. Keep the truth of the Word of God, because God's judgment is coming. There's a judgment that will be exercised by the Lord. The judgment that now finds many exiled in Babylon. They have been carried off by a foreign army, not because that foreign army was greater and stronger than the army of the Lord, but because they were disobedient to God, and God allowed a lesser army to carry off a greater army and remove a people. So Ezekiel was the one who received this apocalyptic vision. What Ezekiel saw must have been quite disturbing. He describes the experience as this. In verse 1, he says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and through the Spirit of God, He was set in the middle of a valley." Notice he writes, "the valley." So there's an assumption there that those who are reading this would know which valley of which he was speaking. He says that he was brought out by the Spirit of the Lord. John says the same thing when he was drawn up into heaven. That apocalyptic revelation that he was given of heaven, and ultimately Christ returning, ultimately Christ claiming what is his. And so he was drawn out to this valley by the Spirit of the Lord. And as we would look at it, he was essentially drawn out into a vast graveyard. This place where there were thousands and thousands of bones of people that were scattered on the ground. And he was given a tour round about of this valley. He reports the quantity of bones. There were very many. He reports the condition of the bones. They were very dry. Massive amounts of bones. Demonstrates that they had been there for quite some time, and the condition in which they were in. Essentially, he says, these people were very dead. Very dead. Now, why would such a detail be added that the bones were very dry? Many of you know, we've spoken about this before. It was a common Jewish understanding that if a person is dead for 3 days, there is no hope. They are done. Their life, their physical life is over. In John chapter 11, we read of the death of Lazarus. You may recall that story. Jesus heard about the death of Lazarus, and then he remained where he was. And then on the fourth day, he arrived to where Lazarus was in Bethany. So verse 17 of that chapter writes, so when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. All hope was lost. But what did Jesus declare in that moment? Do you remember? He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. He asked the question to Martha, do you believe this? Do you believe this? What Jesus is saying is, it doesn't matter how long someone's been in the grave. I know what you believe. I know what you think. I know what you've been taught. But it doesn't matter how long someone has been in the grave, because He has the power to resurrect a lifeless body and give it new life, which ultimately He does with Lazarus. As the author of life, God can raise a lifeless body. How many of you are trusting in the power of God to raise a lifeless body? Yes, we are. He has the power to do that. He will do that for every person who has lived. Now, let me be clear here. Believer and unbeliever alike, you will be raised from the dead. You will have a resurrection. You'll be raised up to glory, or you'll be raised up to judgment. But you will be raised up from the dead. The sea gave up the dead which were in it. Speaking of John in Revelation. And the death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged according to their deeds. All people have and will experience a resurrection. Now, the Jewish people were not without at least an early thought about resurrection. This is important regarding Ezekiel's answer. They had a hope of resurrection, but not a fully matured theological understanding of that resurrection. Daniel later speaks of that in chapter 12. And so this expectation was evidenced in their burial practices. The dead were essentially buried twice. When a person died, they were put in a tomb. We understand that from the New Testament. They were put in a tomb. They were left there while the body went through that process of deterioration. Then once there were bones that were left, the family would go in and gather those bones, and then they would put them in an ossuary along with the other relatives. The purpose of this was to have everyone together awaiting what? A resurrection. Everyone would be together. So Ezekiel was brought into this scene full of dead men's bones, and then God asked him this, Son of man, can these bones live? Can these bones live? Now, it seems that Ezekiel gave a wonderfully correct political answer, didn't he? How did he answer him? He said, oh God, you know. Lord, you know. I don't know, but Lord, you know. Well, let's think about his answer just for a moment. His answer expresses both a lack of understanding, but it also expresses a great deal of faith in the Lord. It's a really honest answer. Lord, you know. First, if Ezekiel and Israel would have had a fully developed resurrection theology, wouldn't you have expected Ezekiel to say, yes, Lord, these bones are going to live again. These bones will live again. I trust and know that they will live again. In John chapter 11, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, He will give to you. Martha's expressing a significant understanding of resurrection. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And then she answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And then Jesus said, I am that resurrection, Martha. I am the resurrection. I am the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. She had great confidence. Ezekiel didn't. Oh, Lord, you know. You know. It's an honest answer. But notice the second part of this answer is also an answer of faith. Ezekiel acknowledges that God knows all things and God is capable of all things. This is a theological truth that Ezekiel knew. And he answers the Lord that way. It's a theological truth we must know. God is capable of all things. We're His creation. He has total authority over our lives. God has complete authority over your life. We never get out of the authority of God. Unbelievers, if they reject God, they do not get out of the authority of being under the authority of God, do they? Because we are God's creation, believer, unbeliever alike. All of us are under the authority of God. And so we must know, be confident that if God chose to bring to life dry bones, then God can bring to life dry bones. He has the authority and power to do that. So there is an element of faith that is working here. An element of faith within Ezekiel's understanding. God, you know. You and I demonstrate that same faith when we initially trust God for salvation. We demonstrate that faith when we allow the sanctification process of the Lord to take place in our life. Lord, you can grow me. Lord, you can change me. We are exercising faith when we submit ourselves to the work of the Spirit of God.